The night was thick with the scent of dust and wildflowers, the wide Texas sky stretching endlessly above the ranch as if it held secrets only the stars could whisper, and Clara McAllister sat on the wooden porch steps of her late father's house, hugging her knees to her chest while she tried to convince herself that she was strong enough to resist everything pulling her heart in opposite directions. She had sworn to herself that coming back here was only about sorting out the estate, selling what she could, and leaving this land of broken memories behind. Yet the moment she saw him, Luke Carson, the cowboy who had once been her entire world, standing tall by the corral with the same broad shoulders, the same easy swagger, and the same eyes that had once promised her forever, the walls she had spent years building around her heart began to tremble, threatening to collapse under the weight of longing. He had walked up to her earlier that evening, his hat tipped back, his grin disarmingly warm, and though his voice was roughened by years under the sun, it still carried the low rumble that made her pulse trip over itself. She had told herself to keep her distance, to remember the nights she had cried herself to sleep when he hadn't followed her to the city, to remember how betrayal had tasted when he chose the ranch over her, yet when he leaned against the railing and asked if she was hungry, offering to fix her something since he'd been looking after the place, she found herself nodding before she could even think. Dinner had been awkward, the air thick with words neither dared to speak, and every time his hand brushed too close across the table she had stiffened, reminding herself that desire was not the same as trust, but her body seemed to have forgotten the difference. Now, as the crickets sang and the horses shifted in the barn, Clara pressed her palms against her arms to still the shiver racing down her skin, and she told herself that she would not fall for the warmth in his voice, the steadiness in his gaze, or the comfort in the way he made this lonely house feel like home again. Luke hadn't pushed her, not once, though she could see the flicker of wanting in his eyes, a longing that mirrored her own, and it was that quiet patience that frightened her most, because patience meant he was willing to wait her out, willing to stand close without touching until she broke. She had denied the spark all evening, refused the way her heart leaned toward him every time he shifted near, and when he had offered his hand to help her down the porch steps earlier, she had tucked her fingers stubbornly into her pockets, pretending she didn't notice how his touch hovered in the air between them. But it was impossible to ignore the way the night seemed to bend around his presence, how even silence felt alive when he was near. Memories tugged at her. The night rides across open fields, the stolen kisses behind the hay barn, the whispered dreams they had once shared under this very sky. She had left it all behind because dreams hadn't been enough, because she had needed more than promises tied to the weight of land and cattle, but sitting here now, watching him move across the yard with the ease of a man completely at home in his world, she wondered if maybe she had misjudged what enough really meant. Still, she clenched her jaw and told herself not to soften, not to give in, because the scars of yesterday still ached too much to risk reopening, and so when Luke came back from the barn, his hat in his hands and a quiet smile on his lips, she rose quickly, brushing past him with a muttered good night, retreating into the house before the storm in her chest could betray her. Behind her she heard him call softly, her name wrapped in the husky tenderness she remembered all too well, but she closed the door before he could say more, leaning her forehead against the cool wood, her eyes stinging with the battle between desire and fear. She would deny him tonight, she told herself fiercely, because surrendering to Luke Carson again could mean losing herself forever, and yet even as she climbed the stairs alone, the echo of his voice lingered like a touch she couldn't erase, reminding her that denial was already unraveling under the weight of a love she had never truly let go. Sleep did not come easily to Clara that night, for every creak of the old farmhouse seemed to echo with the memory of Luke's voice, and every shift of the wind carried the faint scent of leather and cedar that clung to him like a second skin, teasing her restless heart with reminders of the man she had sworn she no longer needed. She tossed beneath the quilt her grandmother had stitched years ago, staring at the ceiling beams, tracing the cracks in the wood as if answers lay hidden in their lines, but all she found was the relentless ache of what had been left unfinished between them. By dawn, when the rooster crowed and the sky blushed with streaks of pink and gold, Clara gave up on sleep entirely and padded downstairs, determined to bury herself in the work of sorting through her father's papers before Luke could try to corner her into another of those gentle, steady conversations that broke down her defenses without her even realizing. Yet when she stepped into the kitchen, she found him already there, sleeves rolled up, the scent of strong coffee rising between them, and for a moment she just stood in the doorway, her throat tight, remembering mornings long ago when they had dreamed together over mugs just like these. Luke looked up, his eyes meeting hers with that familiar spark of quiet warmth, and though she stiffened, he only tipped his chin toward the table where he had set out 2 cups, as if her joining him was inevitable. "Morning," he said softly, and though the word was simple, it carried a weight that made her heart stumble. She muttered a return greeting, trying to sidestep him, but the brush of his presence filled the room too fully to ignore. She sat reluctantly, wrapping her hands around the mug though she had no appetite, telling herself she would sip and leave, yet somehow minutes stretched into an hour as he spoke about the ranch, the horses, the drought that had nearly ruined last summer, and she found herself listening, really listening, because the cadence of his voice wove a strange comfort through her resistance. He never asked her why she had returned, never pushed her to explain her sudden reappearance after years of silence, and it was that restraint that disarmed her more than any declaration could have, because Luke Carson had always known when to press and when to wait. When she finally rose, muttering something about boxes in the attic, he only nodded, but his eyes followed her as though he could see straight through the armor she clung to. The day stretched long with the weight of memories packed into trunks and dusty envelopes, each item she uncovered a thread pulling her back into the life she had fled. By mid-afternoon her hands were smudged with dirt and her heart bruised by nostalgia, and she startled when Luke's voice drifted up the stairs, low and steady, asking if she wanted a break. She told him no, sharper than she meant, but he climbed up anyway, ducking beneath the low rafters, his presence filling the small attic until the air felt too thin. He didn't say much, just crouched beside her and began sorting quietly, his calloused hands steady against the fragile papers, and though she tried to ignore the nearness of him, her pulse betrayed her, beating wild and uneven. When their fingers brushed over an old photograph of her father on horseback, a jolt sparked through her so strong she nearly dropped it, and she yanked her hand back as though burned, snapping that she didn't need his help. The look in his eyes, hurt, yes, but also patient, resolute, nearly unraveled her, but he only nodded and set the photo gently aside, his silence saying more than words ever could. For the rest of the afternoon they worked side by side in a fragile truce, the unspoken tension humming between them like a storm waiting to break. As dusk fell and the cicadas began their song, Clara retreated again, telling herself she needed distance, that she could not afford to let old wounds reopen, yet when she lay in bed that night, she couldn't shake the image of Luke's hands steady beside hers, his eyes holding a promise she both feared and longed to believe. She pressed her face into the pillow, vowing once more that she would not let him in, but deep down, she already knew the fight was slipping from her grasp, because denial might hold back her words, but her heart was already listening to every beat of his silence. The third day dawned hot and restless, the sun pouring over the fields with a fierce golden blaze that made the air shimmer, and Clara tried to lose herself in chores around the ranch, telling herself that physical work would quiet the storm inside her, but no matter how many boxes she sorted or how many dusty shelves she scrubbed, Luke's presence was never far, lingering in the steady rhythm of boots on the porch, in the low whistle that carried across the pasture, in the way his shadow seemed to move in tandem with hers even when they weren't in the same room. She wanted to pretend she didn't notice, wanted to insist to herself that she was only here to tie up loose ends and nothing more, but the truth gnawed at her every time their eyes met and held for too long, every time her breath caught when he smiled without meaning to, every time her skin tingled with awareness of him, so close, so familiar, so impossibly dangerous to her fragile defenses. That evening, after the sun dipped low and the sky bled with streaks of crimson and violet, Luke saddled 2 horses and appeared at the porch, leaning on the rail with that quiet steadiness that had always been his way, and he said simply, "Come ride with me." Clara froze, torn between the urge to slam the door and the ache to say yes, and for a long moment she only stared at him, her pulse pounding in her throat, but then something in his gaze, soft, patient, unyielding, pulled her forward, and before she realized it she was slipping into her boots and following him down the steps. The horses shifted beneath them as they mounted, and soon they were riding side by side into the open fields, the cool night air rushing against their faces, the stars unfolding overhead like an endless map of promises, and for a while the silence between them felt like old times, comfortable and alive, stretching with the rhythm of hooves on dry earth. When they finally slowed by the creek, the moonlight silvering the water, Clara swung down first, needing space, needing to breathe, and Luke followed, tying the reins loosely before turning to her with that steady gaze that had haunted her dreams since she'd left. "Why are you really back, Clara?" he asked, his voice low, not accusing, just searching, and though she opened her mouth to deflect, to throw up the same wall she'd been hiding behind for days, the words caught in her throat because the truth pressed too hard against her chest. She turned away, hugging her arms tight, watching the fireflies dance above the tall grass, and finally whispered that she didn't know anymore, that she had thought she came to close the book on this place, but every day it felt like the pages were only opening wider. Luke stepped closer then, his boots crunching softly on the grass, and she felt the warmth of him before he even touched her, his presence wrapping around her like the night itself, and her breath came shallow as he said her name in that husky, tender way that made the past flood back all at once. She spun toward him, anger and longing tangled in her chest, telling him he had no right to look at her like that, no right to stir up everything she had fought so hard to bury, but the words shook even as she hurled them, betraying the weakness in her heart. Luke didn't flinch, didn't retreat. Instead, he lifted a hand as if to brush a strand of hair from her face, then stopped just short, his fingers trembling in the space between them, the restraint in his touch somehow more powerful than contact itself. "I'm not here to hurt you," he murmured, his eyes locked on hers, and the weight of unspoken years stretched taut between them, so fragile it felt like one breath could shatter it. Clara's chest ached, her body screaming for the touch she had denied for nights, but fear clamped tight around her ribs, reminding her of all the ways love could splinter and leave her broken, so she turned abruptly, stepping back, shaking her head, insisting that she couldn't, that she wouldn't, even as her voice cracked. Luke's jaw tightened, pain flickering through his eyes, but he only nodded slowly, as if to say he would wait, even if it cost him every piece of his heart. They rode back in silence, the air heavy with everything unsaid, and when Clara lay awake later, staring at the ceiling while the echo of his almost touch burned against her skin, she knew with a sinking certainty that she was losing the battle she had sworn to win, because her heart was already galloping faster than her fear could hold it back. The days that followed wrapped Clara in a haze of contradictions, each hour pulling her deeper into the trap of her own heart, for no matter how she tried to keep her distance, Luke had a way of weaving himself into the fabric of her hours, quiet and steady as rain soaking into thirsty earth. He fixed the broken hinge on the barn door without being asked, carried the heavy boxes from the attic down to the porch as if it were the most natural thing in the world, and even repaired the old windmill that had sat rusted for years, his sweat-damp shirt clinging to his broad back as he worked under the scorching sun while Clara stood at the window, telling herself not to look, not to remember, not to feel. But the harder she fought, the stronger the pull became, like a tide dragging her out into deep waters where resistance only made her sink faster. At night she would lie awake listening to the creak of the floorboards beneath his boots as he moved about downstairs, her pulse quickening with every sound, and though she told herself she hated the way his presence filled the house, she knew in her bones she was terrified of the silence that would follow if he left. On the fourth evening, when a sudden summer storm rolled across the plains, thunder cracking the sky wide open, Clara stood at the kitchen window watching the rain lash against the glass, her heart thundering just as wildly, and she nearly jumped when Luke appeared behind her, his reflection solid and unyielding in the glass. He spoke softly, asking if she was all right, and when she nodded too quickly, he stepped closer, so close she could feel the heat radiating from his body, the charged air between them more dangerous than the storm outside. "You don't have to do all this alone," he murmured, and the gentleness in his voice cut deeper than any demand could, because it reminded her of every moment he had once been her anchor, the boy who had steadied her when her world fell apart, the man who had held her dreams like they were precious glass. Her throat tightened as she turned, snapping that she didn't need saving, didn't need him, didn't need this, but the words rang hollow even in her own ears, and Luke's eyes softened with a patience that both infuriated and unraveled her. The storm raged louder, lightning throwing shadows across the walls, and in that sudden flash of brightness, Clara saw the truth in his gaze. He wasn't asking her to surrender, he was only asking her to let him stand beside her. Something inside her cracked then, a fissure widening in the armor she had worn for years, and tears she hadn't expected stung her eyes. She turned away quickly, pressing her palms to the countertop, whispering that she couldn't go through losing him again, that the pain of being left behind once had nearly destroyed her, and she would rather live walled off forever than face that emptiness a second time. Silence stretched between them, heavy as the storm, until Luke's footsteps drew closer, slow and careful, and then his voice came low and rough with emotion, telling her that he had never stopped loving her, that he had chosen the ranch not because she wasn't enough, but because he hadn't known how to be enough for her in this land all at once. His confession tore through her like lightning, illuminating the truth she had refused to see. It hadn't been abandonment, but fear and pride that had split them apart. Her chest ached as she struggled to breathe past the flood of emotions, torn between anger at what they had lost and the fierce, aching pull of what might still be saved. When she finally looked at him, his face was lit only by the flicker of storm light, his eyes raw with vulnerability, and her resolve wavered dangerously. She wanted to reach for him, wanted to erase the years with one touch, yet fear still clawed at her ribs, whispering that surrendering to him would mean handing over every fragile piece of her heart. So she did the only thing she could. She fled, slipping past him with trembling hands, retreating upstairs as though distance could silence the wildfire racing through her veins. Behind her, she heard him whisper her name, a plea tangled in the thunder, and it followed her into her room, into her restless dreams, into the marrow of her bones where denial no longer felt like protection but like a slow suffocation she could not endure much longer. The morning after the storm dawned clear and sharp, the sky washed clean as if the heavens themselves had wept away the heaviness of yesterday, but Clara woke with her chest still aching, the remnants of her flight echoing in her pulse as she sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the worn floorboards and knowing she could not keep running forever. The house was quiet, the air carrying the faint scent of coffee drifting up the stairs, and she almost stayed hidden, almost convinced herself to pack her bags and leave before Luke could find her, before her heart betrayed her completely, but something in the stillness pushed her to move, to face what she had been denying since the moment she first set eyes on him again. She descended the stairs slowly, her breath shallow, and found him on the porch, leaning against the railing with his hat tipped low, the early sun catching the strong line of his jaw, his gaze fixed on the horizon as though searching for answers in the fields stretching endlessly before them. For a moment she only watched him, her heart beating so hard she wondered if he could hear it, and then she stepped forward, the boards creaking under her weight. He turned at once, his eyes meeting hers with a flash of surprise that softened instantly into something deeper, something raw, and the silence between them hummed like a live wire, pulsing with all the words they hadn't said. Clara's throat tightened, her courage warring with fear, but she forced herself to speak, her voice trembling as she admitted that she had been terrified, that every time she looked at him she felt the same pull she had all those years ago, and it scared her because she didn't know if she could survive the breaking again. Luke listened without interruption, his eyes steady, his expression open, and when she faltered he stepped closer, closing the distance slowly as though giving her every chance to retreat, but she stayed rooted, her heart too tired of running to move. "You don't have to be afraid of me, Clara," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "I let you down once because I didn't know how to fight for both you and this land. I thought I had to choose, and I chose wrong. But if you'll let me, I'll spend the rest of my life proving that I can hold on to both." The sincerity in his words unraveled the last threads of her defenses, and before she could think, before she could stop herself, the tears she had held back for years spilled free, hot and unrelenting. Luke reached up then, slowly, carefully, his hand brushing against her cheek, his thumb catching the tears, and this time she didn't pull away, didn't flinch, didn't deny, because the touch she had resisted all these nights felt less like danger and more like home. Her breath hitched, her body trembling under the weight of the moment, and when he leaned in, his lips hovering just above hers, she felt the world hold its breath with her. For an instant she hesitated, fear whispering one last warning, but then the fire that had been building in her chest for years surged forward, and she closed the distance, pressing her mouth to his in a kiss that was both fury and forgiveness, both desperation and release. The world fell away around them, the porch, the fields, even time itself dissolving as the kiss deepened, wild and consuming, setting her alight from the inside out. Every denial, every wall, every night she had told herself she didn't need him shattered in the heat of that kiss, and she clutched his shirt with trembling hands as if to anchor herself, while his arms wrapped around her with a strength that promised he would never let go again. When they finally pulled apart, breathless and shaken, Clara pressed her forehead to his, laughter breaking through her tears, the sound bright and trembling. "I hate that you can still undo me like this," she whispered, but her voice held no venom, only the fragile truth of surrender. Luke smiled, his own voice rough as he replied, "Then let me spend forever proving that undoing you means putting us back together." And for the first time in years, Clara let herself believe it, let herself breathe without fear, let herself imagine a future where love was not something to outrun but something to lean into, strong and steady as the man who held her. The land stretched wide before them, the sky endless, and though the road ahead would not be simple, she knew in that moment that she would not face it alone, for she had denied his touch all night, all week, all the years between them, but his kiss had set her wild on fire forever, and she no longer wanted the flames to ever burn out.